So now that we've gone over the architecture at a high level of how product analytics works, let's go ahead and get this installed. So again, going back to the Helm chart repository, the README contains all the information you need in terms of prerequisites to be able to do this. We provide instructions for Google Cloud Platform, though you can look inside the task file, which we do for a lot of the automated, to automate the installation of the cluster. You could follow these steps in a way that's compatible with the cloud infrastructure of choice that you may have, whether that's AWS, Azure, OpenShift, and so on. We are looking to eventually support other platforms, but for now, we're providing just instructions on how to do it for Google Cloud. As noted, this is a public Helm chart. It's a public repository, so we welcome any contributions to make this more accessible for anybody using GitLab. So we'll go ahead and go into the installation steps and just go line by line. The prerequisites, again, are listed here in terms of what you need. It is a Helm chart. You will need Google Cloud access. You'll also need to be able to execute Go tasks as well. And you'll need the Kubernetes command line interface as well. So once you've got that all set up, then we can go through and actually create a task file. So as the instructions indicate, there's a couple of things we need to set up in terms of being able to deploy this cluster based on what region we want, what GCP project we want to use, and a couple of other pieces of information in terms of domain name, DNS zones, and so on. So I'm going to go ahead and set this up. For the purposes of this demo, it's actually already set up, but I'll just go ahead and quickly show you what it looks like just to give an example. So the DNS zone is what we need to use if we're using Google Cloud DNS to be able to set up the correct records for your domain names to point to the right services. And a domain name we're using because the collector does need to be accessible, at least in this demo. It's available on the internet to be able to collect events that are being sent. This can work in air-gapped installations if you've got internal name resolvers and things like that. But that would be based on how you would set up your service discovery to be able to facilitate that. But now that I've got this already set up, I'm going to go ahead and exit out. And looking at the instructions, I need to run the task setup cluster to be able to create the cluster. So since I have already defined the release and cluster name, I'm just going to go ahead and run the task itself. So task setup cluster. And that's going to go ahead and just create the cluster on your Google Cloud project. And we'll wait for this to do its thing. Cool, so now that our cluster is set up, we can finish with the rest of the instructions in terms of installing Certificate Manager for our SSL encryption, as well as actually installing the Helm chart itself. So let's get back into the documentation. So we've already run the task setup cluster. We have some instructions if you're using a existing cluster in terms of switching to the context. If you're familiar with Kubernetes, then that's something that you can just kind of skip through. We have a couple other things that we need to install in order to get this all set up in terms of setting up the DNS zones and preparing our custom values YAML for the Helm chart. So looking at the instructions, we also need to run task install cert manager. So we're going to go ahead and do that. And then we're going to let it do its thing. As mentioned, Certificate Manager is what we use. We use Let's Encrypt for SSL certificates. We also set up some internal SSL to make sure that the data being transferred within the cluster is encrypted in transit. Now that we have Cert Manager installed, we can proceed with the rest of the instructions, including setting up the DNS zones and preparing our custom values file for the Helm chart. It's worth noting that the custom values file, once it's prepared, can be customized to fit your needs. There's a lot of configuration options in there, and some do need to be changed in terms of setting up the right email address for your SSL certificates and things like that. We do hard code some credentials in there as just a way to get the cluster set up and running. We do highly recommend using a secrets manager to be able to securely administer your product analytics stack. So let's get into it. We're going to go ahead and run setup task. We're going to go ahead and run task setup DNS. And that's going to go ahead and set up the addresses we need to reserve the IP addresses, as well as pointing the correct domain subdomains to those addresses. So now that that's set up, we can then run prepare custom values. And so that's going to take our example values YAML and then generate some credentials for you randomly, just for the purposes of demoing this or at least getting started. But like I mentioned, highly recommended to use a secrets manager to be able to make sure that this is as secure as it can be. But definitely take a look at the custom values YAML. So you'll see a lot of information here, and looking into the core values YAML itself, there are even more in terms of how you can customize product analytics to fit your needs. We already include some things like stat exporters if you want to plug this into your monitoring stack. And it includes a bunch of different information in terms of the API secret to use, all the credentials that you would need to have GitLab interact with your product analytics stack. And so this information will be useful later on when we connect the product analytics stack to our GitLab instance or our GitLab project. So hang on to this information. But now that this is ready, the only thing I'm going to change real quickly is the email address. Since we are using real SSL certificates, we do need a real email address. So I'm just going to go ahead and change this a little bit to be a little bit more accurate. So there's my email if you also have any questions. But anyway, going back to the instructions now, we've already run the setup for the DNS. We've already prepared the customs YAML file. We did a quick look through, though. All the default values, even though there's hard-coded credentials, are good to let us at least get started. So now we're very close. We just need to make sure that we prepare all the chart dependencies. So we need to set up the Helm repos. So we're going to go ahead and do that. And while that's running, I'm just going to walk through the instructions in terms of, now this is the time for us to actually install the Helm chart. So I'm going to copy this, and yeah, this is basically the final step. So I'm going to copy this. I'm just going to keep this to the same as my release name and install the Helm chart. And while that's going, you can keep an eye on your Kubernetes cluster to see what's being installed and so on. So you can see the Helm chart's doing its thing and starting to create all of the different services as indicated by the architecture overview. So give your cluster time depending on your specifications. But yes, it will start to, once everything is in the running state, you'll be good to go.